Reports of child abuse dropped during the pandemic when kids were separated from mandatory reporters like teachers.
Their importance cannot be understated. They are often what stands between a child and really serious harm.
Now that kids are back in class, those reports are up, but teachers are being put on hold for a long time when they try to call the state's child abuse hotline.
I'm not at all surprised at wait times and how challenging it is right now.
Remember that pop-up COVID testing company being investigated by the state of Oregon? Well, now Washington's Attorney General is suing them, claiming they handed out false test results. And we follow up on a story along the coast. Tonight, a small-town church ordered to help the homeless less is fighting back.
We violated the law by feeding people pizza on Friday.
Here's the story.
I'm Maggie Vespa. Welcome to The Story on this Tuesday. This is the show where, if you're not familiar, your questions and your comments drive our coverage. Email thestory@kgw.com and use the hashtag TheStoryKGW. Let us know what you think of what you see on this show and let us know what you want us to cover. So, that in mind, let's get started. So to that point, tonight's big story came from a viewer, a teacher, actually, who suspected a kid in her class was being abused and then tried to call Oregon's child abuse hotline. That teacher then sat on hold for so long on that hotline that she reached out to us, hoping someone basically could figure out why. Ashley Korslund started digging into this and then reached out to DHS, who, will note, refused to talk on camera about this story twice.
Experts are paying close attention to how the pandemic has impacted reports of child abuse.
With the onset of COVID, we saw the number of cases referred for child abuse evaluations drop pretty dramatically.
Jenny Gilmore Robinson is with CARES Northwest, an advocacy group that serves children at the center of child abuse investigations. Gilmore Robinson says reports of child abuse plummeted at the start of the pandemic when kids began online learning. Mandatory reporters of abuse, like teachers and coaches, were separated from students and couldn't look for signs of maltreatment. But experts knew the abuse didn't stop.
I know of no one in the child welfare field that believes that abuse has decreased.
And so
that's echoed by Washington County District Attorney Kevin Barton.
Child abuse reports dropped significantly by about 50% here in Washington County, but we all knew that child abuse itself was not dropping.
Take a look at this data from the Oregon Department of Human Services, or DHS. It shows the number of calls to the Oregon Child Abuse Hotline. Before the pandemic, in April of 2019, the hotline received more than 600 calls. Just 1 year later, when schools shut down, the number of calls dropped to half that amount. Then, in September of 2021, with students back in schools and around mandatory reporters, calls started to go back up.
So we're still about 18 to 20% behind where we would normally be for this point in the year pre-COVID.
But we found that mandatory reporters still have a challenge getting through to the state's hotline. Many are sitting on hold, waiting to report suspected abuse. We even received an email from a frustrated teacher. She wrote, "I'm a mandatory reporter in Oregon. I called DHS today to report suspected child abuse. I was waiting in a queue of 30 people. People can't be expected to wait on hold for an hour or more to report child abuse." District Attorney Barton has heard similar stories.
I have heard that there are wait times that DHS has been working on to reduce. I don't know where they stand now in terms of where those wait times are, but anecdotally I've heard that there have been long wait times for callers.
We checked with DHS. The agency would not make anyone available for an interview, but did acknowledge a significant increase in calls and an increase in wait times. DHS provided this data showing wait times for the hotline. Before the pandemic, most callers sat on hold less than 15 minutes. At the start of online learning, average wait times dropped below 1 minute. Then, in the fall of 2021, you can see that number shoot up. In December, the average wait time was 30 minutes. But DHS says not all calls merit an investigation. Officials tell us that in 2021, 75% of calls did not result in an assigned allegation of abuse or neglect. Oftentimes, mandatory reporters call because a child is in crisis, but not necessarily being abused. DHS also cited staffing issues as another factor in long wait times for callers. The agency says it has only about 66% of total positions answering phones at any given time.
And so the reality is this is a fixable problem. If there are long wait times, we need more people and we need more resources so that this can be prioritized and it can be the most important thing.
Okay, Ashley Korsland joining us now. So Ashley, I mean, DHS acknowledges that there's a problem, like these wait times are too long. So what is being done about this?
Yeah, so Maggie, the agency says first thing is trying to hire more people to staff up that phone line, that hotline, and also improve recruitment efforts there. But a big priority, though, is educating these mandatory reporters on the difference between child abuse, how to spot signs of child abuse, and then how to identify families who just need more support, where there is no child safety issue at hand.
Gotcha. And to just kind of pull back the curtain on this, like you started working on this story. We got that email from a viewer months ago, like a few months ago. So at least in that time, since you started looking into this, has DHS made any progress hiring more people?
Well, yeah, that's the thing. So we started working on this a few months ago. We wanted to take some time and actually follow the progression and follow the data over the fall and into the winter months as the year wrapped up. And also give DHS some time to let us know, hey, have we made any improvements in these areas we've identified there are issues? And so I reached out this morning to a DHS spokesperson to find out if they have in fact hired more people. I haven't heard back yet, but when I do, Maggie, we'll let you know.
Okay, we appreciate the report in the meantime. Ashley Korsland, thank you.
Yeah.
In the last few months, there's also been a surge in demand for COVID tests. You might have experienced this yourself. We hear about this a lot. Pharmacies run out of COVID tests. Doctors' appointments have filled up recently. And as Omicron spread, a lot of people got desperate. Enter the Center for COVID Control, a free pop-up COVID testing site with locations throughout the country, testing thousands of people each day. They had 3 locations in the Portland metro area specifically, and we visited this one in Northeast Portland. You might have seen this story. This location was kind of housed by like an abandoned storefront. It was, as you can see, covered in graffiti. It was surrounded by trash. And more, people started wondering how legit this place actually was. And investigations from other news outlets across the country revealed some people were getting emails with their test results before they had even been tested at these places. They were waiting to be tested. Dozens of people filed complaints with local authorities across the country, and those complaints actually caught the eye of Bob Ferguson. He is Washington State's Attorney General, and now he's suing the Center for COVID Control. And he says the company basically provided invalid, false, or delayed results to people, and it operated without a business license. He also says the center did not store test samples properly, leaving them in garbage bags for more than a week. Look at this. He sent us that photo. Apparently, he says these samples should have been refrigerated, not left in bags like that. He says employees also reported the company instructed them to, quote, lie to patients on a daily basis, and that the company violated the Consumer Protection Act.
But it is clear from the photographs of those garbage sacks filled to the brim with COVID tests and the testimony we're hearing from employees that there will be many violations. And so the exposure financially to this company will be a very large sum. And frankly, I intend to seek that.
So the Center for COVID Control told us they are a legitimate business and that all the testing was free. They also said they bill the federal government and insurance companies. But it's worth noting this company closed up shop at all of its locations across the country about 2 weeks ago. Keep you posted on updates on that story. Now let's get to this email from Elena. She wrote, so the next legislative session in Salem is a short session lasting maybe a month. Why is it a short session when most sessions are several months long? I don't get it. Great question. Thank you so much. So Oregon lawmakers used to only meet every 2 years as opposed to every year. This especially made sense back in the days, frankly, a while ago, before cars and planes, when it would take days for some lawmakers to get across the state and get to the session in Salem. By 2010, we had cars and planes, basically. Oregon, at that point, then, was just one of 5 states that still had that system of having sessions every other year, and a lot of people wanted to change that. And in fact, Senate President Peter Courtney told the Oregonian at the time, we cannot make laws. We cannot do a budget the way it's going now. Society is so dynamic and so diverse. There are so many more people than when they first designed this structure that it cannot respond the way it should. Again, that was 2010. So that same year, voters passed a constitutional amendment here in the state requiring Oregon lawmakers to meet every year. The measure says they need to meet for 160 days in odd-numbered years and 35 days in even-numbered years. So this created the regular and the short sessions. Now, some Republicans have said the short session should really be focused on budget issues and not on passing a bunch of new, basically, policy bills. And that was their argument during the last short session in 2020, when Democrats were trying to pass cap and trade for the second time. You might remember that failed after Republicans walked out again. And virtually because of that, the session died and nothing got passed. So the question now is, will they run into that same issue again? This new short session starts today. We'll see. Pat Doris spent the day at the Capitol.
Each year when lawmakers gather in Salem, people interested in influencing the new laws that are born here gather to let their feelings be known. This year, it was as many as 300 people who are against mask mandates and vaccination. Some of those protesters tried to get in without masks and were stopped by Oregon State troopers. Inside the Capitol, business continued as usual. Lawmakers have a ton of money to spend during the session, as much as $2 billion, all of it from taxpayers. It's astounding to longtime lawmakers like Senate President Peter Courtney.
From there, you know, we got so much money in the budget, I just hope we can find ways to spend it all over the state, not just in one area of the state. And because of fires and drought and homelessness, all the big issues, and this school closure thing, I think we have to take a look at our budget and make sure whatever it takes, we keep those schools open. That's got to happen.
Governor Kate Brown wants $500 million saved for a rainy day. Some of the biggest potential spending packages include $200 million the governor wants for workforce training that's focused on healthcare, manufacturing, and construction. $200 million to expand high-speed internet access to areas of the state that don't have it. $400 million to build more affordable housing and more renter-landlord relief payments. $120 million to move Portland's Tubman Middle School and make way for an expansion of I-5. And $100 million to convert the Elliott State Forest in the Coast Range into an Oregon State University research forest. Republicans, who are outnumbered by Democrats in both Oregon's House and Senate, want more money spent on law and order. And recent polls show voters seem to agree.
I mean, people are feeling it. I mean, when you have almost 90 murders in Portland, we got drug cartels in Southern Oregon taking over and growing illegal marijuana. We got to do something, and funding for police is a big part of that.
The Oregon House has a new speaker. Dan Rayfield from Corvallis now holds the powerful position. He told me public safety will come with more investment in mental health services.
And how do we reduce violence in our communities? And so I'm very interested in seeing how our committee chairs prioritize those bills, those investments, as well as, again, really focusing on investing into our mental and behavioral health services as well, because both of those together really complement each other nicely.
Because of the pandemic, there are few people physically in the Capitol building. Most committee hearings are being held online. The building is open, but masks are required unless someone has a medical exemption. It's the first day of the legislature. There'll be plenty of time for battles in the future, but today is about optimism. After all, there is plenty of money to spend. In Salem, Pat Doris, KGW News.
A few months back, a small city on Oregon's coast decided a church was feeding the homeless too much. And they passed a law ordering the church to pass out food less. Not only has that church refused, now they're suing, and they have the backing of their bishop.
For the city to restrict that is basically a violation of a fundamental expression of ours to express our Christian faith.
When the story continues.
Welcome back. Keep sending in those questions and comments to thestory@kgw.com or use that hashtag #TheStoryKGW on Twitter.
How do you tell a church that they can't feed people? Isn't that what churches are supposed to do? In our diocese, in the Episcopal Diocese of Oregon, our churches feed people.
So we are circling back to that interview from a story that we aired in October. A city on Oregon's coast basically ordered a church to feed the homeless less. St. Timothy's Episcopal Church was handing out food 6 days a week, and the Brookings City Council passed an ordinance demanding churches in residential areas serve food no more than 2 days per week. And a lot of you had thoughts on that story. Gail wrote, for instance, is that community also only going to feed themselves and their family only twice a week? Not allowing a church to do Christ's work is disturbing. We promised, because of feedback like that, to stay on this story and frankly cut to this week. Now we have an update. St. Timothy's argues the ordinance violates their First Amendment right to the free expression of their religion, and as a result, they are suing the city of Brookings, filing this complaint in federal court this week. The church is even demanding a jury trial via this complaint. This is happening now, by the way, Father Bernie Lindley says, because the ordinance went into effect last week, specifically on January 26th.
And that was a Wednesday. We feed Friday through Monday. So on Friday, we were in violation of that city ordinance because we did not have the permit that they were requiring. So we served something like 120 slices of pizza to people who were hungry. We violated the law by feeding people pizza on Friday.
And Friday was the day they sued. Now, a refresher. The reason the city argued that St. Timothy's was feeding so many people so often, they argued they were basically operating as a restaurant, and they weren't zoned to operate as a restaurant. The church, the city says, is in a residential area. It's also worth reiterating, neighbors asked the city council to address this. They claimed the church's routine was causing chaos.
I'm here today because I don't feel safe in my house. This is a public health concern. It's a safety concern for the public. It's not. We're not trying to solve the nation's crisis of homelessness here in Brookings, Oregon.
But I've had things stolen from my backyard. I had to put fences up. You know, it's the drug use is what makes it uneasy. They're selling drugs down there. They're trading drugs, whatever they're doing, but. I literally have to go on a walk every night just to make sure, you know, no one's going to be coming up into my property.
So the church told us then, and they say now, they were willing to work with those neighbors. But now at this point, with this new ordinance, their beef, they say, is with the city, who we should note declined to comment for this story. And St. Timothy's now isn't alone in this fight. Their story got a lot of press, and now they're being backed by the Episcopal Diocese of Oregon and by their bishop. And she and I spoke earlier today.
Churches, though, are subject to city ordinances and to zoning codes, essentially, and one could make the case that an interpretation of religion is always going to be subjective. And the city has said, hey, there are enough churches that you could rotate and different churches could feed people on different nights, and therefore people would get these basic services. But zoning wise, we just can't have neighbors made the case churches turning into restaurants, which is they say is what's been happening with St. Timothy's. So what's your take on that?
So the argument over the zoning code is part of a fundamental piece of our lawsuit, because the city is claiming, was making a claim that it does not stand up. We were grandfathered in. The church was there before the codes were actually created. So the church predates any code that the city believes it is now requiring us to conform to. But the other piece that's very concerning is a city determining that the church is now a restaurant. There's some unbelievable parts of that claim, and we are also contesting that. We are not a restaurant. We are a church.
Again, city officials say they cannot comment on an existing lawsuit. Now, both Father Lindley and Right Reverend Diana Akiyama, who you just saw there, told us they are waiting for the city to respond to their lawsuit. They added they would rather the city be putting effort into building shelters and affordable housing to address the bigger problem of homelessness, which they note is growing in smaller communities across the state. For now, that church plans to keep on feeding people. Keep you posted. Still ahead, you probably heard people talk about a 4-day work week. Well, how about a 4-day school week? That idea has been floated in Portland, and now there's a new study out showing the potential impact of that schedule on students. When the story continues. Welcome back. You might remember this story from a few months ago. The Portland Teachers Union made a pretty big proposal to the district. No in-person school on Fridays for high schoolers. Instead, students, they said, could use that day for self-taught learning, and then teachers would use it for planning and grading. And you all had a lot to say about this. Cynthia wrote on Facebook, "I really like this," and proposed it to our school board. The schools would get a proper deep cleaning each week. The teachers would actually have time to do their planning, grading, and professional development, and the students would have time to focus on large, time-consuming projects and other assignments. But Amy said, "I don't think less school time benefits anyone," would propose more school time to get Oregon students further ahead. She said our schools have been closed longer and more restrictive than other states, and it is definitely going to show, maybe not today, but in the coming years. Our thanks to both of them. Well, now Oregon State University has actually published a study looking at how a 4-day school week would impact kids. Here's Christine Pitawanich.
The professor I spoke to says he hopes his research helps schools better understand what to think about before moving to a 4-day schedule. He says before the pandemic, 137 schools across Oregon opted for a shorter week.
Yeah, I'm Paul Thompson. I'm an associate professor of economics at Oregon State University.
Paul Thompson analyzed how a 4-day school week compared to the typical 5-day schedule. He says the study looked at more than 340,000 high school students between 2010 and 2019.
We're looking at students who kind of come in with the same level of achievement, the same background, coming from very similar types of schools.
And after looking at standardized math tests,
we find that students that switch to the 4-day school week, see reduced achievement when they get to 11th grade And we contribute a lot of that to drops in instructional time.
He says it's possible math at higher grade levels is just more difficult to catch up on at home. Thompson says the majority of schools that switch to a 4-day week tend to be in rural areas.
It's more of kind of a lifestyle change for them, something that fits well with the makeup of their communities.
But it's students at the more urban schools that switch to a 4-day week who seem to perform worse compared to other urban schools sticking to the 5-day schedule.
We see a lot of, non-rural areas, that are considering these for things like teacher, retention, cost savings, and that is a different, objective function that they're thinking about, right?
And when those reasons are drivers for a 4-day week, lengthening the 4 days to make up for all the lost time may not happen. By contrast, Thompson says rural schools planning to make the switch long-term, particularly those that do well, tack on extra hours in school over the course of 4 days. Thompson says one thing to consider, the study was done before the pandemic, meaning a 4-day school week basically meant 3 weekend days. But now, due to COVID, there's infrastructure for more online learning at home, which could be helpful to students on that 5th day who might otherwise have the day off. And it may help teachers by easing their load. Christine Pitawanich, KGW News.
Hey guys, before we go, a quick programming note. We want to let you know the story is actually going on a little bit of a break during the Olympics. We're going to be on tomorrow night, but after that, we'll be off for 2.5 weeks. So here's a little calendar to give you a better idea. Also, I think our editors might have been a little bored today. We'll be back on Monday, February 21st. But in the meantime, as you can see, our team will be off researching the stories you want to see covered, and will pop up on different shows here on KGW. So be sure to keep sending in those questions and comments to the story at kgw.com. Again, we'll be back tomorrow night. After that, taking a little break. That does it for this show. The news at 6:30 with Laurel Porter starts now.